In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen. Hearing the gospel reading this morning, one question quickly comes to mind. Why? What is the rhyme and reason for reading the texts that we read when we read them throughout the Christian season? Why does it matter? Couldn't we just jumble them all up without rhyme or reason? So long as we got through all of the Bible every 12 months and in a 3-year cycle and hit all the high points of Jesus' life. Why this text? Why the Sermon on the Mount? Why now? Because it would seem that the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, well, they're lessons for any time of year, right? They are, as Father Joel said last week, Jesus' greatest hits, a compendium of his teachings, a compilation, a collection of the things that Jesus said that had lodged themselves inside the collective memory of the church decades after the death and the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus Christ. Wouldn't these verses of instruction work anywhere? These admonitions? This sermon of Jesus? Why is it that the church gives them to us now, at this 5th Sunday, after the Epiphany, but also in the shadow of the foreboding season of Lent? As I was considering why this text, why the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' most famous sermon on this innocuous 5th Sunday after Epiphany, not a high holy day, I was reminded of the time I set foot on the very ground that Jesus used to teach on, the Mount of Beatitudes. I'll never forget it. It was in 2007, and I had the privilege of going on something called the Middle Eastern Travel Seminar. It was sponsored by the Patulik Foundation out of Atlanta and led by renowned Old Testament Bible scholar Max Miller. Now, at the time, Dr. Miller was Professor Emeritus of Old Testament at Emory, former director of the PhD programs there, and had done a lot of work, invested his life in biblical cartography or biblical map making. Max Miller was an encyclopedia with legs when it comes to the Middle East. So if you could go somewhere with Max Miller in the Middle East, you wanted to do your best to go. Now, our group had been in the Middle East about 2 weeks on the evening that we rolled into the driveway of the monastery that sits astride a small portion of the Mount of Beatitudes. We'd arrived from the south, so that was the first time I'd ever driven through what is modern-day Tiberias, also an ancient town. On the western side of the Sea of Galilee, we traveled up to the monastery on the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee, the lake. And the monastery is built there as a memorial to Jesus' teaching there, his most famous sermon. Now, after our routine of arriving, myself and Max and a few seminary colleagues, we made our way to the back and rear of the monastery to find an appropriate place for worship, as if we probably couldn't have sat down in the parking lot and had an appropriate place to worship on the Mount of Beatitudes. But as we made our way behind the monastery, I'll never forget it, because we found a small, quiet place in the very back, and it was right on the face of the hill. And as you walk up to it, you know you're about to encounter something special. And there it is, the Sea of Galilee from a viewpoint you've never seen. I was really there. Couldn't believe it. Had to pinch myself. We're here. Now, up until this point in the trip, those of you who've traveled, you know when you go visit historical sites and archaeological visits, there's a lot of, it might have happened here. There's a lot of traditional sites. The witness is greater or lesser with this event. And scholars argue and give best guesses and approximations about what happened where and who might have done it. But when you come to the Galilee and the Mount of Beatitudes, that's when Max Miller would say something like, we know Jesus taught here, on this mountain. There can be no doubt. He walked here. He lived here in this area. You see, the Galilee and the rolling Beatitude hillside is this odd place where heaven and earth come together and you're kind of squeezed between them. And you're not really sure what to do about it. Heaven and earth meet in a special way in the Galilee, and you get caught in its embrace. You feel the love that the heavens have for the earth. And from the Mount of Beatitudes, you are literally transported back into the biblical world. You can stand there and allow me to give you just a brief tour. But you can stand on the face of that hill and look south at the whole western side of the shoreline, and you're going to see the city we just came through, Tiberias. It's an ancient city founded in AD 20 by Herod Antipas, who was then the ruler of Galilee. It's only mentioned once in the Bible, and it's in John 6, when people dispatch boats there looking for Jesus. Where's he at? What's he doing? Got to find him. And then if you move further up the western side of the lake, you'll see a little patch of green palms. And that's the ancient village of Magdala, from which hails Jesus' most famous woman disciple, Mary Magdalene. And then you make your way up the coast some more, and you're almost right at the brow of the hill that we're standing on, and you come across a traditional site known as Tabgha. This is the place of the feeding of the 5,000 where it's commemorated. And on the shoreline there is where Jesus first began calling his disciples. And on the coast here is a church erected to commemorate that. It's the Church of the Primacy of Peter. And inside the church, it's built over the Mensa Christi, which is the rock traditionally that Jesus had cooked breakfast on for his disciples in John 21. All of these places and more that I don't have time to describe, you can see from right here, from our sermon this morning, from Matthew chapter 5. The teachings and Beatitudes flow from the hilltop over these places and these people and these events that will become the expressions and recipients of the contents of this very sermon in the stories we're going to hear about throughout the year. You see, the Sermon on the Mount holds all these places together. And when Jesus says things like, I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, what he's trying to describe for us is, what does that fulfillment look like? It looks like what you're going to witness around this lake in the stories that follow, with these people in these villages. Fulfillment looks like what Jesus does. You see, the teachings of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount, they flow down the hill into the ordinary places of life. Ordinary. In preparation for the unknown moments of life. You know, for us, these places, when you visit them, if you've been, they're magical. They're wonderful. They're beyond description. Words betray us. It's transfiguring. But for the disciples and the people inside the world of the Bible, they're just mundane places where God met them, where Jesus entered their lives in an unexpected way, and they were never the same. And it's their witness that brings us here this morning. So this brings us back to our question, why the Sermon on the Mount? In this seemingly uninteresting fifth Sunday after Epiphany, on a cold February day, stuck between the Epiphany and Lent. You see, before Jesus arrives here at this moment and delivers this sermon to us, he's had an event that we typically only talk about in Lent, and that is his temptation in the wilderness for 40 days. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot about that time. It's usually a pretty short story. But what it does say is crucial for our reading this morning. Before Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days to get to the place to give us our sermon this morning, he is baptized. His baptism is the Epiphany. It's a New Testament theophany when God claims him and a dove descends upon him. And Jesus has that religious experience of baptism. And John the Baptist has the aha moment as well as everybody around watching it. And we have the aha moment today in being witnesses of it. Jesus is now aware of what God is trying to do with him. He's been marked. He's been named, called. He's been sealed by John the Baptist. And now what does he get to do? He gets to go be by himself for 40 days in the wilderness. And at the end of those 40 days, the tempter comes to him. And he tries to talk him out of his purpose, to dissuade him. And what does Jesus do when he is mentally and physically exhausted? He quotes Scripture. And what does he quote? He quotes Deuteronomy. He quotes the law. He quotes Moses' teachings from a mountain. In the most arid and dry season of his ministry, what Jesus needs when he's questioning himself, and he's praying, and he's looking inwardly, and he's fighting demons, and trying to make sense of where he is and where God's about to send him, where he goes back to, are words from the mountain. Words from another part of the story years ago given by Moses to help him make sense of where he was, where he is, and where he's going. He's remembering what was said. And in retelling the story, he's telling the story first to the devil, but also to himself. And you see, on this Mount of Beatitude, what Jesus does is he gives us the law again for the first time. He puts a new frame on it for us so that we will have it for our new wilderness that awaits us after the Epiphany. Just as Moses had given the law to Israel when they were in the midst of their wilderness, and they needed a good word to sustain them in the arid, dry, rocky Sinai wilderness. Our text this morning reads, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill." So what does that look like? Blessed are the gentle. Blessed are those who hunger for righteousness. Blessed are the peacemakers. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. So why this Sermon on the Mount? Why now, today, with these readings, Isaiah and Corinthians? Because we find ourselves, church, in between the season of knowing who Jesus is in the Epiphany and learning who we are in Lent and what God's going to do for us and doing in us. The Beatitudes frame where we're going. The Sermon on the Mount frame where we're going as we stare down that barrel of 40 days coming off the high tide of the season of Epiphany. This sermon will sustain us after our religious experience with God when we're most likely to forget it. Jesus' words, like Moses's, will sustain us after our religious experiences for when we are most likely to forget them. You see, God can deliver us. We can have a testimony. We can have a spiritual epiphany with the Baptist by the river. I know many of us have. But in the wilderness ahead, I know we can forget it. I know I have. Now, if we're lucky, we get to choose when to participate in the season ahead. But if we're unlucky, sometimes Lent creeps up on us, and it's thrust upon us. And we find ourselves clawing our ways through this arid, rocky landscape, wondering, when does this end? And in this season, that's when the tempter comes to us, and he tries to tempt us away from peacekeeping. We're tempted to not be meek. We're tempted to not love. We're tempted to not seek righteousness. In fact, it's here we don't want our light to shine, let alone putting it under a bushel. What light, Lord? Don't you see where we are? I'm all out of light in this wilderness. Or what salt, Lord? Me? Salt? I can barely wake up out here, let alone worrying about being somebody's spiritual flavor. You see, the 40 days is near. The darkness ahead is always preceded by mountainous moments of theophany and epiphany, as we'll see later in the Transfiguration in a few weeks. The wilderness awaits, and we will be tempted. We are human. We're vulnerable. How do we survive these seasons we're about to face liturgically? That is, practically, in our real, everyday lives? Well, the geography around the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, they embed within it the spirit of Epiphany. And it reminds us that Jesus is one we can listen to. He is trustworthy. He is the one who in Epiphany, the star shone over the manger. He's the one the wise men found. He's the one the shepherds came to. He's the one the priest sanctified in the temple a few days ago. He's the one that's been sent. His word is trustworthy. We've had the Epiphany. We can listen. So this morning, on this fifth Sunday, we can stand on the Mount of Beatitudes, and we can point from it. We can point not only at places in the Bible where God did amazing things, but we can point at places in our life where God's done amazing things for us too. And that's what's going to sustain us in the wilderness. Remember when I stepped out of the boat and tried to walk to Jesus, yet my knees buckled because the water looked really deep and it was really black and dark down there and the waves got really high, but Jesus still reached down in compassion and pulled me up, despite my lack of faith, right there on that lake. Or over here, I sat on the hillside and Jesus fed me with food I didn't even see him bring. How did he do that? And over there on that seashore, Jesus called my name for the first time, just like Peter and Andrew and Philip. And at this place, in this small village, I can't explain it, but God did something miraculous for my family. And I'm healed. You see, here on this Mountain of Beatitudes, Jesus is teaching us and reminding us. And right here he says, "Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are you when you're insulted for my name's sake. You are the light of the world." You've heard it say or said, but I say. So why here? Why the Sermon on the Mount? Why the Beatitudes? Why now, in this liturgical moment? Because like Moses, Jesus' teachings are the words that will become the bread for us when our hearts may feel bare in the days ahead.